Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be fixing this Pink Nintendo DS Lite. It looks to be in decent shape on the outside, but has some hidden issues like corrosion on the inside pins, and once we turned it on, a damaged top screen. So let's jump into the fix. I found a replacement top screen on eBay because I'm fairly certain that the old one cannot be fixed. Sometimes these will come with speakers attached to them, but this one did not. If yours has the speakers, then this will purely be a disassembly and reassembly. But in my case, we will need to attach the speakers, which we'll get into a little bit later. Remember to be careful handling the screen's ribbon cables, since creases or other damage can cause connection failures once attached. On to the disassembly. Remove the battery cover and battery first, since you definitely don't want any power running to the circuits while you're working, and there are screws underneath to remove anyway. The battery can sometimes be a little tricky to remove, but if you pry it carefully on one side, it should pop free without much effort. There are a total of 7 screws to remove from the case, and 2 of which are hidden underneath the rear feet. These are a combination of Phillips and tri-wing screws, so be sure you have the right tools to be able to remove them in the first place. I'll put a link in the description for a tool set that I use for this too. Once those are out, carefully pry open the backside. You can use a small tool as a wedge, but it's not too tightly secured where you need to pry at it much. Then remove the 2 top bumper button assemblies carefully because they have springs built into them. Try to keep these together as much as possible so they don't go flying everywhere. Next is removing the wireless card and the 2 wires. The card isn't too difficult to remove, you just need to pull at the top and it'll pop free. It's not only attached with a connector, but it also has a sticky foam block on the opposite side. The foam block is the harder of the 2 to remove though. Now onto the wires. These are a bit of a pain to remove, but the black wire snakes underneath the cartridge slot. It can, and most likely will, get stuck while you're doing this, and turned around underneath the slot's housing too. Just take your time and move it around, but if you can't get it out like me, I opted to remove the bottom outer housing completely to get a better angle to see it. This needs to be removed anyway, so it's not like it's an extra step. Before I got into removing that, I saw the corrosion coming out of the cartridge slot and didn't want little bits of that to be coming off as I was working on the other parts. So I gave it a quick clean now to remove all the big debris, and then I'll come back later in order to fully clean it out. But once the bottom housing was detached, I could remove the ribbon cable, and this gave me a lot more room to work with and see where the black wire was getting bound up on. I ended up using a tweezers to turn the wire's heads gently while pulling on the other side, and it came out without any more issues. Next up was removing the 2 hinge screws from the left side, which gives you the ability to remove the rest of the bottom housing. See that little slit in the housing on the right? That's where the ribbon cable needs to be fed through. Now I could have just cut it off here, but it's good practice for putting in the new screen later. Next, take a sharp blade or a small tool and pop off the 4 colored screw covers on the front screen. These have sticky backs like the feet from the bottom of the housing, and I actually lost one during reassembly since it got stuck to something and I couldn't find it again. So make sure to keep these away from your screws so they don't accidentally go missing. Once the screws are out of the top housing, pry it apart while also pushing down in the direction of the hinge to slide it apart at the same time. This helps to separate the 2 halves nicely. Bend the plastic frame slightly and you can push the screen out at this point too. The ribbon cable needs to be wound up into a tight bundle so it can pass through the small hinge hole as well. This is really easy to remove, but it's just not as easy to reinstall though. Here are the 2 screens side by side. The new one has a slightly different metal housing, but it is still the same size and shape, which is more important. If you have speakers attached to your new screen, then obviously you can skip this step of removing them from the old one and reattaching to the new one. Be sure to tin the connections on the new screen first, as it makes the transfer of the parts a lot easier. Then you just need to reheat those solder points while holding the speaker wires in place. It makes it a lot easier this way since you don't need a third hand to hold on to something too. The old pink screen protector needs to be peeled away and attached to the new screen as well. Try to match it up as best as possible, but you can put it inside of the front housing and use that as a guide to make sure it is seated in the right location as well. Now comes the reassembly. I removed the white and black wires completely from the hinge hole because I didn't want anything to bind up the screen's ribbon cable. The ribbon cable needs to be wound up very tight and honestly is probably a lot easier for somebody with smaller hands. I'm going to say I was able to do it on my first try for this video, but please be aware that it may take several tries. Unfortunately, I don't have any other good way to be able to get this cable through except trial and error. But just remember that it is fragile and should not be creased. I was going to use the old tape on the back of the first screen in order to hold the speaker wires in place, but decided to use some new Kapton tape instead. This is optional, but it kept those loose speaker wires from moving around and helped to streamline the close of the housing. There's normally a lip in the back of the screen to prevent them from moving around, but this newer screen doesn't have as deep of a gap at this spot. From here, the reassembly is just the reverse of the disassembly, so if you really only needed to swap the screen out, you're almost done. I, however, need to deep clean the cartridge slot to make sure all of the debris and the corrosion is gone for good. Even if you don't have any issues with yours, it may not be a bad idea to clean it out every once in a while. I started by scraping out the pins with a combination of Q-tips soaked in IPA and smaller tools to be able to break the debris free. Whatever this stuff was, it was a little sticky and was hard to break away from the pins. Maybe leftover soda or something like that. But a combination of these two methods ended up working out pretty well. I also cleaned the inside, and even though it's hard to see, it looks way better than it did before. This unit wasn't able to play any games before, so it should fix this problem for good. On to the final reassembly and a few tips that you should know. Using a tweezers to fish the black and white wires into place is very helpful. The black wire can get stuck going back in behind the cartridge housing, and having some longer tweezers helps to hold the wires in place nicely. Speaking of the wires, make sure that they are not in the path of the outer housing. The screw holes at the top need some extra clearance around them, and moving the wires so they make room for this is easy once they are popped back in place. The housing should pop back together without much effort, so if it's not going together easily, just take a quick look and see why. Also, don't tighten the screws down too much. You want them to be snug but not crazy tight where it could strip out the ends. Once the screws are all in place, all that's left is testing it. I'll put the screw covers on afterwards, but this one is working great now, and the top screen really looks good too. I hope this helped you with your repair project, and if you need additional help with one of your other ones, be sure to check out some of my other repair videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next fix.